So picture this for a second. The Paul finally makes it to Jerusalem after years of traveling, teaching, and telling people about Jesus. And instead of a warm welcome, it turns into chaos. A crowd forms, things get hostile fast, and suddenly he's being attacked. Roman soldiers step in just to keep him alive, and now he's standing before the Jewish ruling council, trying to explain himself, knowing full well this isn't exactly going to be a fair hearing. Alright, so here's where things get really intense. Paul is now standing in front of the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin. These are the top religious leaders, the ones who basically hold all the authority when it comes to Jewish law. And Paul knows who he's dealing with here. This isn't just a casual conversation, this is serious. And what's interesting is how he starts. He doesn't come in defensive. He doesn't try to soften the room. He just looks straight at them and says, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." Now, that's a bold way to open. I mean, think about it. He's standing in front of people who believe he's completely in the wrong, maybe even a traitor, and he says, essentially, my conscience is clear. I've done nothing against God. That's not arrogance, it's conviction. Paul genuinely believes that everything he's done, even now, even preaching Jesus, has been in obedience to God. From his perspective, if he hasn't betrayed his faith, he's fulfilled it. But the moment he says that, everything shifts. The high priest, Ananias, who's presiding over this whole thing, doesn't even let the conversation develop. He just gives an order, have this man struck on the mouth. And just like that, Paul gets hit. No trial, no evidence presented, no discussion, just immediate violence. Which, by the way, is completely against their own law. According to Jewish law, you don't punish someone before they've even been proven guilty. So this isn't just harsh, it's illegal. And Paul reacts instantly. He fires back. God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law. And do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? That line, whitewashed wall, it's basically calling someone a hypocrite. Like, you look clean and righteous on the outside, but underneath it's corruption. It's actually something Jesus said before too, calling out religious leaders who were more concerned with appearances than truth. So Paul is not holding back here. He's pointing out the contradiction in real time. You claim to represent the law, but you're breaking it right in front of everyone. And honestly, you can kind of feel the tension in that moment, right? Like, everything just escalates. This is not going smoothly at all. But then something unexpected happens. The people standing nearby immediately push back on Paul. They say, "Do you revile God's high priest?" In other words, hey, do you realize who you're talking to? And that's when Paul pauses, and you can almost hear the shift in his tone. He responds, "I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." So he pulls back. Now this is really interesting, because Paul just went from calling the man out pretty sharply to apologizing, or at least correcting himself. He acknowledges that if he had known this was the high priest, he wouldn't have spoken that way. And he even backs it up with scripture, basically saying, look, the law itself says you don't speak evil of a leader among your people. So he's not denying what he said, but he's recognizing that he crossed a line in how he said it. And that moment right there, it's kind of revealing. Because Paul isn't perfect. He's bold, he's passionate, but he's also human. He reacts like anyone would after being struck in the face. And then he corrects himself. There's a humility in that. Now, there's been a lot of discussion over the years about why Paul didn't recognize the high priest in the first place. Because you'd think, this is the high priest. That should be obvious, right? Well, not necessarily. Some people suggest that Paul may have had poor eyesight. There are hints in other parts of scripture that his vision wasn't great, so it's possible he literally just couldn't see clearly who gave the order. Others think it was more about the situation itself. Everything happens so fast, he gets hit. He reacts, it's just instinct. Like, you don't stop and think, wait, who authorized that you just respond? And honestly, that makes sense too. I mean, if someone hits you out of nowhere, your first reaction probably isn't calm analysis, it's immediate response. There's also the idea that the setting may not have been as formal or obvious as we imagine. Maybe the high priest wasn't dressed in a way that clearly identified him at that moment. Or maybe the room was chaotic, voices overlapping. It's not entirely clear. But here's the thing, the text doesn't actually dwell on the reason, it just tells us what happened. Paul didn't realize who had spoken. He responded sharply, and then once he understood, he adjusted. And that adjustment matters, because even in a moment where he was treated unjustly, even when he was literally struck without cause, he still chooses to respect the principle of honoring authority. That doesn't mean he agreed with what the high priest did, not at all. He already called that out as wrong, but he's able to separate the injustice of the action just from his own responsibility in how he responds, and that's not easy. Like, it's one thing to stay calm when everything is fair. It's another thing entirely when you're being mistreated. That's where most people, honestly, most of us would just double down, get louder, get more defensive, but Paul doesn't stay there. He pulls it back, acknowledges the standard, and aligns himself with it. So already, just in these first few moments before the council, you're seeing this mix of boldness and humility. He stands firm in his conscience, but he's also willing to admit when he steps out of line. And the room, it's already on edge. Like, this hearing hasn't even really begun, and things are already tense, emotional, a little unpredictable. You can kind of feel it building, right? Like something bigger is about to happen. And honestly, it is. So, right in the middle of all this tension, voices raised, tempers already flaring, Paul does something that, honestly, is kind of brilliant. He looks around the room, and I don't mean just casually glancing, I mean he really notices who's there. Because the Sanhedrin, this ruling council, it isn't just one unified group, like it's actually made up of two different factions. Two groups that, yeah, they're both Jewish leaders, but they don't exactly see eye to eye on everything. On one side, you've got the Sadducees. On the other, the Pharisees. Now, on the surface, they agree on a lot. They both care deeply about the law, about tradition, about maintaining religious authority. But when you zoom in a little, there are some pretty major differences in what they actually believe. And Paul knows this. So in that moment, standing there, he realizes something like, okay, this isn't just a courtroom. This is a divided room. And instead of trying to defend himself in a way that would probably just unite everyone against him, he does the opposite. He leans into the division. He raises his voice and says, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." Now, at first, that might sound like a simple statement, like he's just explaining his background, but no, there's more going on here. Because Paul isn't just sharing where he came from, he's choosing his words very carefully. He identifies himself as a Pharisee, which is true, that's his heritage. He grew up in that tradition. His father was a Pharisee, that's part of his identity. But then he connects it to something very specific, the resurrection of the dead. And the moment he says that, it's like he drops a spark into dry grass. Because here's the thing, the Sadducees, they don't believe in the resurrection at all. Not just Jesus' resurrection, they don't believe in any resurrection. They don't believe there's life after death. No heaven, no hell, no future judgment, nothing beyond this life. And it doesn't stop there. They also reject the idea of angels. They don't believe in spirits. Basically, anything supernatural beyond what you can see and touch, they're not on board with it. Which, if you think about it, is a pretty stripped down version of belief. And honestly, the way some people remember it is kind of funny. It's like they're sad, you see, because they don't believe in anything beyond this life. Now, the Pharisees, they're completely different. They do believe in the resurrection. They believe in angels, in spirits, in the whole spiritual realm. They believe there is life after death, that God will raise the dead, that there's more than just this world. So even though both groups are part of the same council, on this issue, they are miles apart, and Paul knows exactly what he's doing. When he says, "I'm on trial because of the resurrection," he's not just defending himself, he's reframing the entire situation. He's basically saying, the reason I'm here is because I believe something that a whole group of you also believe. And just like that, the focus shifts, because now it's not just Paul versus the council. Now it's Sadducees versus Pharisees. And you can almost feel the room start to split. Like, imagine the moment. People looking at each other, whispers turning into arguments, tension building in a completely different direction. Paul has taken what was a united front against him and fractured it, and that's not accidental. This is strategy. He understands that if everyone stays united, they're all coming at him together. But if they start arguing with each other, then suddenly, he's not the center of the conflict anymore. He's changed the battlefield. And honestly, it's kind of genius. Because think about it. He doesn't lie. He doesn't manipulate facts. Everything he says is true. He is a Pharisee by background. He does believe in the resurrection, specifically the resurrection through Jesus. But he highlights the one issue that he knows will create division. And sure enough, it works. The room doesn't stay focused on Paul for long. Instead, the deeper disagreement that's been sitting under the surface this whole time, it comes rushing up. And suddenly, the council isn't unified anymore. They're divided. Now, it's important to understand this wasn't just some random theological debate. These differences mattered. They shaped how each group understood God, the future, even justice itself. For the Sadducees, if there's no resurrection, no afterlife, then everything is about this present world. Power, influence, maintaining order, that's where their focus tends to land. But for the Pharisees, if there is a resurrection, if there is life after death, then what happens now carries into eternity. There's accountability beyond this life, there's hope beyond death. So when Paul brings up the resurrection, he's not just poking at a small disagreement, he's hitting something foundational. And it forces everyone in the room to pick a side. Now, from Paul's perspective, this move does a couple of things at once. First, it exposes that this whole situation isn't as simple as Paul is guilty. There are deeper disagreements at play. Second, it buys him space. If they're arguing with each other, they're not all attacking him. And third, and this is important, it brings the conversation back to something central to his message. Because at the core of everything Paul has been preaching is the resurrection, not just as an abstract idea, but the resurrection of Jesus. That's the heart of it. So even in this moment, even in a high-pressure situation, even when his life is on the line, he doesn't drift away from that truth. He leans into it. Now, of course, the way he does it here is strategic. He knows it will stir things up. He knows it will shift the dynamic in the room. And maybe you could even say he kind of throws a match into a pile of dry leaves and steps back a little. But it's not reckless, it's intentional, because Paul understands something really important sometimes. You don't win by confronting everyone head on. Sometimes you change the direction of the conversation. Sometimes you reveal what's already beneath the surface. And in this case, what's beneath the surface is a deep divide that had nothing to do with Paul until he brought it to the forefront. And just like that, the entire atmosphere shifts. The council that was ready to come down on him as one is no longer one. They're split, they're arguing, they're distracted, and Paul, he's no longer the only target in the room. Now, everything is about to escalate even further, but at this exact moment, you can see it clearly. This was a turning point, a single statement, carefully chosen, that completely changed the outcome of the room. And just like that, the room erupts. I mean, it doesn't just get tense, it explodes. The moment Paul brings up the resurrection, everything shifts from a controlled hearing into full-blown chaos. Voices start rising, people talking over each other, arguments breaking out across the room. It's no longer Paul on trial, it's the council itself unraveling. The Sadducees, of course, are immediately triggered. They reject the resurrection entirely. So for them, this isn't just wrong, it's offensive. But the Pharisees, they lean the other way. They believe in the resurrection. They believe in angels and spirits. So now, instead of standing together against Paul, they're turning on each other. And it gets loud, really loud. The text describes it as a dissension, a division, and you can almost picture it. Right, groups forming, people stepping forward, pointing, arguing, trying to be heard over the noise. And then something kind of unexpected happens. Some of the Pharisees actually start defending Paul. Not fully, not like they're suddenly on his side in everything, but enough to change the tone. They stand up and say, "We find no evil in this man." That's huge, because just moments ago, Paul was the one under attack. Now, part of the council is saying, wait a second, maybe he hasn't done anything wrong. And they even go a step further. They say, what if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? Let us not fight against God. And that right there just pours gasoline on the fire. Because remember, the Sadducees don't even believe in angels or spirits. So now, not only are they arguing about resurrection, but the Pharisees are bringing in angels and spiritual encounters, basically suggesting, what if God is actually involved in this? And the Sadducees are like, no, absolutely not. So the argument intensifies. At this point, it's not even a hearing anymore. It's a shouting match. It's disorder. It's chaos. And right in the middle of it all is Paul, still standing there. And things get so out of control that the Roman commander, who's been trying this whole time to figure out what's going on, realizes this is about to get dangerous. Like, physically dangerous. The text says he feared that Paul might actually be torn to pieces. That's how intense this got. So once again, the Romans step in, they send soldiers down into the middle of the crowd, and they literally take Paul by force, pull him out of the chaos, and bring him back into the barracks. It's the second time this has happened, and you can almost imagine the commander thinking, what is going on with this guy? Every time he shows up somewhere, everything just explodes. But from Paul's perspective, this isn't just confusion, this is danger. He's been attacked by a mob, dragged into a hearing that turned into chaos, and now he's back in custody again, not because he's guilty of anything, but because things keep getting out of control around him, and then everything goes quiet, because the scene shifts. No more shouting, no more arguing, no crowd, just Paul, alone. It's nighttime now, he's in a prison cell. And if you just pause for a second and think about that, this is a man who has been through so much already. Beaten, opposed, misunderstood, and now sitting in a cell after another day of chaos. And then, something happens. Something completely different from everything we've just seen. The text says that the following night, the Lord stood by him. Jesus appears to Paul. Right there in that prison cell. Not in the noise. Not in the chaos. Not in the courtroom. In the quiet. And he speaks to him. He says, "Be of good cheer. Paul, take courage. For as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome." And it's such a contrast, right from a room full of shouting voices than to a single voice in the silence. From confusion to clarity, from chaos to something steady, Jesus doesn't rebuke him. He doesn't question what just happened. He doesn't even go into detail about the situation. He just gives him what he needs in that moment. Take courage. And then he reminds him, this isn't the end of your story. You've testified about me here in Jerusalem, and you're going to do it again in Rome. Which, if you think about it, also means something else. It means Paul is going to make it out of this, because Rome is still ahead. There's still more to come, and in that quiet moment, after everything he's just been through, that's the message he receives. Not an explanation, not a strategy, just presence. And a simple, steady reminder. Keep going. You're not done yet. There's something about those words Jesus says to Paul, be of good cheer, or take courage. It's simple, almost too simple, right? Like, you'd expect something bigger, some kind of detailed explanation, maybe a plan, maybe a way out of the situation, but instead, it's just take courage. And the more you sit with that, the more you realize that wasn't random, because this isn't the only time Jesus says that. And in fact, if you look across the Gospels, there are a few really specific moments where Jesus uses those exact words or something very close to them. And every single time, it's spoken into a moment where someone is dealing with fear, or pain, or just discouragement. It's almost like this is how Jesus responds when people are at their lowest. So think about this. One of the first times we see it is with a man who couldn't walk. He's paralyzed, completely dependent on others just to get to Jesus. And when his friends finally bring him, laying him right in front of Jesus, you might expect the first thing Jesus would say is, "Get up and walk." But that's not what he says. He looks at him, and the first thing out of his mouth is, "Take courage." Before anything changes physically, he speaks to what's happening inside. Because imagine being that man, years of being stuck, helpless, maybe wondering if anything will ever change. There's probably fear there, maybe even shame, maybe doubt, and Jesus doesn't ignore that. He meets him right there. Take courage. Then there's another moment, completely different scene. The disciples are out on the water, in the middle of a storm. It's dark, the waves are crashing, and they're already struggling. And then they see something walking toward them on the water. And instead of relief, they panic. They think it's a ghost. So now it's not just the storm they're afraid of what they're seeing too. And what does Jesus say? Same thing. Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. Again, notice that. Before he calms the storm, before anything changes around them, he speaks to their fear. Take courage. Because in that moment, what they needed most wasn't just calmer water, it was steadiness inside the chaos. And then there's this other moment that's a little quieter, but honestly, just as powerful. There's a woman who had been suffering for 12 years. 12 years of a condition that drained her, isolated her, probably left her feeling invisible. She spent everything she had trying to get better, and nothing worked. So finally, in this moment of desperation, she pushes through a crowd just to touch the edge of Jesus' garment. And when she does, something changes. Jesus feels it. He stops. He looks for her. And when he finds her, he doesn't scold her. He doesn't question her. He says, "Take courage, daughter. Your faith has made you well." That word again, take courage, spoken into years of exhaustion, pain, and probably a deep sense of hopelessness. And it's personal too. He calls her daughter. It's not distant, it's not formal, it's close. And then there's another moment where Jesus is talking to his disciples about the future. And this one, it's different because he's not responding to something that's already happening. He's preparing them for what's coming. He tells them, "In this world, you will have tribulation. Not might, not maybe. You will," which, let's be honest, is not exactly comforting on its own. But then he follows it with this, "Take courage. I have overcome the world." So even before the trouble comes, he's already giving them the response. Take courage. And when you line all these moments up, something really clear starts to come into focus. Every time Jesus says those words, it's not because everything is already okay. It's because it's not. It's because someone is afraid, or hurting, or overwhelmed, or about to walk into something really difficult. And instead of removing the situation immediately, he speaks courage into it. Which is kind of interesting, right? Because if we're honest, most of the time, what we really want is for the situation to just go away. Like, fix the problem, calm the storm, heal the condition, change the outcome. And sometimes he does that, but not always right away. And in those moments, what he gives first is courage, not as a replacement for change, but as what you need to face what's in front of you. And that's exactly what's happening with Paul. Because think about where he is when Jesus says this. He's not in a comfortable place. He's not celebrating a victory. Like, he's sitting in a prison cell after being attacked, after a hearing that turned into chaos, after realizing just how unstable everything around him is. And Jesus shows up and says the same thing he said to others before him. Take courage. It's like this thread that runs through all these different moments, all these different people, all these different situations, different circumstances, same words, because the need underneath it all is the same. Fear, uncertainty, discouragement. And Jesus doesn't ignore those things. He speaks directly into them, not in a distant, abstract way, but personally, right where people are. And maybe that's why it feels so consistent. Like, whether it's a paralyzed man, a terrified group of fishermen, a woman who's been suffering for years, or a man sitting alone in a prison cell, the response is the same. Take courage, because whatever they're facing, they're not facing it alone. And that changes everything. Even if the situation hasn't changed yet, even if the outcome is still uncertain, even if the storm is still raging, or the pain has been there for years, or the future feels unclear, there's something about those words that anchors you. Not in the absence of trouble, but in the middle of it. And that's what makes this moment with Paul so powerful. Because it's not just about him. It's part of a pattern. A way that Jesus meets people when they need it most. Right there. In the tension, in the fear, in the unknown, he steps in and says, take courage. So here's the part that can feel a little confusing at first. Because when you look at everything Paul is going through, the arrests, the chaos, the prison, it's easy to think, wait, is this all just spiraling out of control? Like, did things just go wrong somewhere along the way? But when you step back and really follow the bigger picture, you start to see something different. This wasn't random. It didn't just happen. There was actually a direction to all of it, even if it didn't look that way in the moment. Because from here, Paul's journey doesn't suddenly get easier. It actually becomes this long, drawn-out process where he's moved from one authority to another over and over again. It starts right here with the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. That's the first setting. The religious leaders, the ones who are supposed to interpret the law, make judgments, settle disputes. But as we've already seen, that doesn't exactly go smoothly. So then Paul is taken out of that situation and transferred to Caesarea. And now, instead of standing before religious leaders, he's standing before Roman officials. The first one is Governor Felix, and Paul ends up staying under his authority for a while actually, for quite some time. This isn't a quick hearing and done. This stretches out. Felix listens to him, he hears Paul's defense, he hears about Jesus, but nothing really gets resolved. It just lingers. And then, eventually, Felix is replaced. Another governor steps in, Festus. So now Paul has to go through it all again. Another hearing, another defense, another opportunity to explain why he's there and what he believes. And again, no real resolution. It just keeps going. And then it escalates even further, because now Paul is brought before King Agrippa. So think about that for a second. This isn't just local leadership anymore. This is royalty. This is someone with real influence and authority in the region. And Paul stands there, once again, telling his story, explaining what happened on the road to Damascus, talking about Jesus, talking about the resurrection, over and over and over again. Different audience, same message. And all of this takes time, years actually. This isn't a quick chapter in his life, it's a long season. A season where, for the most part, he's not traveling freely like he used to. He's not planting churches in the same way. He's not moving from city to city. He's waiting. He's in custody. Sometimes in prison, sometimes under house arrest, but always restricted. And eventually, Paul reaches a point where he says, enough of this back and forth, because as a Roman citizen, he has a right. He can appeal his case directly to Caesar, which is a big deal. This means his case is now going all the way to the top, to the emperor himself. And that emperor is Nero. So now the journey shifts again, because Paul isn't just moving between local officials anymore, he's on a path that leads straight to Rome. Straight to the center of power. And when you lay all of that out, the Sanhedrin, Felix, Festus, Agrippa, Caesar, it starts to look less like random events and more like a progression. Like each step is moving him somewhere, not quickly, not comfortably, but intentionally. And here's where it gets really interesting, because this exact outcome was actually spoken over Paul's life way earlier, back when everything first started for him, when he first encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, when his whole life flipped upside down. There was a statement made about what his future would look like. that he would carry the name of Jesus not just to everyday people, but to rulers, to kings. That was part of his calling from the very beginning. And now, years later, that's exactly what's happening. But not in the way anyone would expect. Because if you were planning this out, you'd probably think, okay, Paul's going to gain influence, build connections, get invited into important places, maybe speak at gatherings where leaders are curious about what he has to say. You know, something a little smoother. But that's not how it unfolds. Instead, it's prison, it's accusations, it's delays, it's standing trial again and again, explaining himself to people who may or may not even want to listen. And yet, through all of that, he gets exactly where he was meant to go. He stands before governors, he stands before a king, and eventually, he stands before Caesar, the very people he was called to reach, which means something important. The path itself, the hardship, the waiting, the legal process that wasn't a detour, that was the route. That was how he got there. And that's the part that can feel uncomfortable, because we tend to think, if something is difficult, if it's slow, if it's frustrating, then maybe it's off track. Maybe something went wrong. But Paul's story pushes back on that idea, because here, the difficulty isn't a sign that God's plan failed. It's part of how the plan unfolds. And not in a rushed way, either. This takes years. Years of waiting. Years of uncertainty. Years where, from the outside, it might look like nothing is happening, but underneath it all, something is moving forward. Every hearing, every conversation, every defense he gives, he's still doing the same thing. He's still talking about Jesus. The setting has changed. The audience has changed, but the mission hasn't. And maybe that's the key, because even when everything around him slows down or feels stuck, he doesn't stop being who he was called to be. He keeps showing up. He keeps speaking. He keeps doing what he can right where he is. And over time, that leads him exactly where he was meant to go. Not through comfort, not through convenience, but through a process that, at first glance, looks like a series of setbacks, until you realize it wasn't. It was the path all along. And this is where the story kind of presses in on something really personal. Because when you look at everything Paul went through, all the hearings, all the speeches, all the opportunities he had to stand in front of powerful people, you might start to wonder, okay, but what came out of it? Did any of them actually believe? Did Felix change? Did Festus? Did Agrippa? Did Caesar himself ever respond to what Paul was saying? And the honest answer is, we don't really see that they did, at least not in any clear, recorded way. There's no moment where one of these rulers suddenly turns and says, I believe. No dramatic conversion scene, no obvious result that you can point to and say, there it is, that's the payoff. And if you're measuring things by visible outcomes, that can feel a little disappointing. All of that, for what? But that's where we have to be careful, because the story doesn't end with those rulers. There's this small detail that shows up later, almost quietly, and it changes how you see everything. Paul, writing years later, mentions that there are believers in Caesar's household. In other words, somewhere along the way through all those trials, all those conversations, all that time in custody, the message got through, not necessarily to the emperor himself, but to people around him, people who heard, people who responded, people whose lives were changed. And it didn't just happen there. As Paul was moved from place to place, as he spoke to different groups, as he shared his story again and again, some people believed and some didn't. That was always the pattern, and it still is. Which brings us to something really important. Paul's responsibility was never to control the outcome. He couldn't make Felix believe. He couldn't force Agrippa to respond. He couldn't guarantee what Caesar would do with what he heard. That part was never his job. His role was much simpler. Stay faithful. Say what you've been called to say. Go where you're placed, and trust that what happens after that is in God's hands. And honestly, that's not always easy to accept, because we like results. We like to see something happen. We like to know that what we're doing is working, that it's making a difference in a way we can measure. But Paul's story kind of challenges that, because from the outside, a lot of this could look like nothing much changed. The same resistance, the same opposition, the same lack of clear response from the people in power. And yet, underneath the surface, something was happening. Lives were being touched, seeds were being planted. The message was moving into places it had never reached before, even into the inner circles of Rome itself. And Paul didn't always get to see the full picture of that. He just stayed faithful in the moment he was given. And maybe that's the part that really sticks, because it means success isn't defined by how many people respond, or how big the impact looks, or whether things turn out the way we hoped. It's defined by faithfulness, by showing up, by doing what you know you're supposed to do, even when the outcome isn't clear, even when the response is mixed, even when it feels like nothing is happening. Paul just kept going. He kept speaking. He kept trusting. And he left the results where they belong, not in his hands, but in God's. And this is where it kind of circles back, not just to Paul, but to you, because that same voice, the one that met Paul in a prison cell and said, "Take courage," it hasn't gone silent. It's still the same today. And maybe, if you're honest, there's something in your life right now that feels heavy, something that's been weighing on you, fear, uncertainty, maybe discouragement that just won't seem to lift. And here's the thing, God doesn't wait for everything in your life to settle down before he speaks. He meets you right in the middle of it, not always by changing the situation immediately, but by giving you what you need to face it. Courage. Strength that doesn't come from you trying harder, but from knowing you're not walking through it alone. And at the same time, there's another side to this. Because the encouragement we receive isn't meant to just stop with us. We're meant to pass it on, to notice the people around us who are struggling, who are carrying something quietly, and to step in, even in simple ways, and remind them they're not alone either. Sometimes that's all someone needs. Just a reminder, just someone coming alongside them. And then there's this moment where everything kind of lands in a different way. Because the words echo what's been said all along. Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. There's something steady about that. Right, not rushed. Not forced. Just wait. Trust, and know that strength is coming not always instantly, but faithfully. Because courage isn't about having everything figured out. It's about holding on, even when you don't, and trusting that somehow, in ways you might not even see yet, God is still at work. So yeah, maybe courage isn't about everything suddenly getting easier. Maybe it's about finding strength right in the middle of things not being easy at all, and knowing you're not alone there that changes something. If this spoke to you, you can let me know with a like. Maybe stick around and subscribe if you want more like this. Either way, I'm really glad you were here.